There's something most people completely misunderstand about empaths. They think empaths are weak because they are emotional. They think kindness means tolerance. They think patience means permanence. But what they fail to understand is this: an empath can love you deeply while simultaneously preparing themselves to survive without you. And the dangerous part is, you usually won't notice when it begins happening, because empaths do not always leave loudly. Most of the time, they disappear quietly. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring became too painful. Now let's understand something important from a psychological perspective. Empaths are highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency. They notice tone shifts, micro-expressions, emotional withdrawal, passive aggression, fake sincerity, and emotional manipulation long before the average person does. While most people hear words, empaths study emotional congruence. They feel when something is off, and over time. If those emotional injuries repeat often enough, the empath's nervous system stops viewing the relationship as safe. That is the beginning of emotional detachment. Here's the mistake many people make. They assume an empath will keep forgiving forever. And yes, empaths often forgive more than they should. They rationalize bad behavior. They give second chances, third chances, sometimes 20th chances. Because empaths naturally look for pain beneath behavior. They see the wounded child behind the angry adult. They see insecurity behind arrogance, fear behind avoidance, trauma behind emotional shutdown. But eventually something changes. The empath realizes they are bleeding emotionally while trying to save someone who refuses to heal. And once that awareness hits, the entire dynamic changes. Now let's talk about the exact behaviors that make an empath disappear from your life. The first is emotional invalidation. When an empath expresses pain and you mock it, minimize it, ignore it, or call them too sensitive, you create emotional isolation. An empath does not need perfection. They need emotional honesty. The moment they feel emotionally unseen for too long, they begin disconnecting internally. The second behavior is manipulation. Guilt tactics, silent treatment, mixed signals, hot and cold affection, emotional control. These things destroy trust rapidly with an empath because empaths operate heavily through emotional intuition. Even if they cannot logically explain what feels wrong, their nervous system already knows. And when someone repeatedly manipulates an empath, the empath eventually stops explaining themselves. They stop fighting for clarity. They simply leave emotionally. The third behavior is betrayal of emotional safety. This is huge. Empaths open themselves carefully. When they trust someone, they reveal parts of themselves most people never see. Their fears, their childhood wounds, their insecurities, their emotional world. If you weaponize those vulnerabilities later during arguments or moments of anger, something irreversible happens. The empath no longer feels safe with you. And once emotional safety disappears, the relationship begins dying silently. Now here's something fascinating psychologically. Empaths rarely disappear impulsively. People think the empath suddenly changed. Number. The empath was grieving the relationship privately for months. They were watching patterns, studying behaviors, hoping things would improve. And while everyone else saw them smiling, internally they were emotionally preparing for departure. That's why when an empath finally leaves, they often leave completely. Because emotionally they already said goodbye long ago. Now let's discuss another painful truth. Many people become addicted to the emotional availability of empaths without reciprocating it. They love receiving empathy, but they never offer emotional support back. The empath becomes the therapist, the emotional caretaker, the stabilizer, the fixer, and eventually exhaustion replaces love, because no relationship survives one-sided emotional labor forever. An empath may tolerate imbalance temporarily, but eventually self-respect overrides attachment. And when that happens, the empath begins choosing peace over connection. This is where people become shocked, because the empath who once begged for communication suddenly becomes silent. The empath who once fought for the relationship suddenly becomes unavailable. Why? Because emotional burnout changes people, especially people who gave everything they had. Now, this does not mean empaths are perfect. Empaths can become emotionally overwhelmed. They can overextend themselves. They can struggle with boundaries. Sometimes they confuse rescuing with loving. But emotionally healthy empaths eventually learn a powerful lesson. Love without respect becomes self-destruction. And once they learn that lesson deeply enough, our tolerance changes permanently. So if you truly care about an empath, understand this. They are not asking for endless attention. They are not asking for perfection. They are not asking you to become someone else. They are asking for emotional consistency, honesty, respect, communication, emotional safety. Because for an empath, connection is not built through words alone. It is built through emotional alignment. And the moment that alignment becomes toxic long enough, the empath stops reaching toward you. Not because they stopped loving you, but because they finally started loving themselves too. Empaths absorb emotional energy more deeply than most people realize. Most people think empathy simply means being kind, caring, or emotional. But true empathy operates on a much deeper psychological and emotional level. An empath does not just listen to your words, they absorb your emotional state. They notice tension in your voice, sadness hidden behind a smile, frustration concerning, yield beneath silence, and emotional shifts that most people completely miss. This heightened sensitivity makes empaths incredibly intuitive, but it also makes life emotionally exhausting in ways many people never understand. When an empath walks into a room, they often feel the atmosphere immediately. They can sense conflict before anyone speaks, detect resentment behind polite behavior, and recognize emotional pain even when someone pretends to be fine. This is because empaths are constantly processing emotional information from their environment, whether consciously or unconsciously. Their nervous systems become highly responsive to emotional energy, almost like emotional antennas tuned into the feelings of everyone around them. This deep emotional absorption is why empaths often become the emotional support system for other people. Friends, partners, coworkers, and even strangers naturally feel comfortable opening up to them. People sense safety around empaths because empaths genuinely listen without judgment. They create emotional space for others to feel seen and understood. But the problem is that many people take from empaths emotionally without realizing the cost it creates internally. An empath can spend hours comforting someone, encouraging them, calming their fears, and carrying their emotional burdens, only to later feel emotionally drained themselves. What makes this difficult is that empaths often struggle to separate their own emotions from the emotions they absorb from others. They may suddenly feel anxious, exhausted, sad, or emotionally heavy without immediately understanding why. Over time, this emotional overload can create burnout, emotional fatigue, and even withdrawal from social environments. Many empaths grow up feeling different from other people because they experience emotions so intensely. While others may move on quickly from conflict or emotional tension, empaths tend to replay situations internally, analyzing every interaction and emotional detail. They often feel responsible for fixing problems, healing people, or restoring peace in relationships. This can lead to unhealthy emotional patterns where the empath sacrifices their own well-being to keep others emotionally stable. Unfortunately, emotionally manipulative people are often drawn toward empaths because empaths naturally give understanding, patience, and emotional attention. Toxic individuals may exploit this kindness through guilt, inconsistency, or emotional dependency. The empath keeps giving because they believe love, understanding, or patience can heal the situation. But eventually the empath reaches emotional exhaustion. They realize they are constantly pouring energy into people who are not protecting their emotional well-being in return. One of the biggest misconceptions about empaths is that they are weak because they feel deeply. In reality, most empaths develop incredible emotional resilience because they constantly carry emotional weight other people cannot even recognize. Their strength comes from surviving emotional intensity while still remaining compassionate. However, even the strongest empath eventually learns that absorbing everyone's pain without boundaries becomes self-destruction. As empaths mature emotionally, they begin understanding the importance of protecting their peace. They learn that not every problem is theirs to solve, not every wounded person is theirs to heal, and not every relationship deserves unlimited emotional access to them. This is the moment the empath transforms. They stop abandoning themselves to save others. They begin choosing emotional balance over emotional chaos. And once an empath truly learns that lesson, their entire life changes forever. Repeated emotional disrespect slowly destroys trust and emotional safety, especially for people who feel emotions deeply. Many people assume trust is broken only through major betrayals like cheating, lying, or abandonment. But in reality, trust often dies through smaller patterns repeated consistently over time. A dismissive comment here, emotional neglect there, sarcasm during vulnerable moments, ignoring someone's feelings, mocking sensitivity, or making a person feel emotionally invisible. These things slowly chip away at emotional security until the relationship no longer feels safe. For an empath, emotional safety is everything. They do not connect with people only through conversation or physical presence. They connect through emotional honesty, consistency, and the feeling that their vulnerability will be respected instead of used against them. When that emotional safety exists, an empath becomes deeply loyal, supportive, and emotionally invested. But when disrespect enters the relationship repeatedly, the empath's nervous system begins responding to the relationship as a source of stress rather than comfort. One of the most damaging forms of emotional disrespect is invalidation. This happens when someone nemesis another person's feelings by calling them dramatic, too sensitive, irrational, or emotional. While these phrases may seem small to some people, they create powerful emotional wounds over time. The empath begins feeling misunderstood and emotionally alone, even while remaining physically close to the person. They start questioning whether their emotions are safe to express at all. Another form of emotional disrespect is inconsistency. One day someone is loving, attentive, and emotionally available, and the next day they become cold, distant, or emotionally withdrawn without explanation. This emotional unpredictability creates confusion and anxiety for the empath because human beings naturally seek emotional stability in close relationships. When affection becomes unpredictable, the relationship begins feeling emotionally unsafe. The empath starts overanalyzing behaviors, searching for hidden meanings, and emotionally preparing for disappointment before it even arrives. What Kess repeated emotional disrespect so dangerous is that it changes how a person feels internally over time. At first, the empath may communicate openly about their pain. They may try to explain how certain behaviors affect them emotionally. They may offer patience, understanding, and chances for improvement because they genuinely want the relationship to heal. But if the disrespect continues despite those conversations, something begins changing quietly inside them. The empath slowly stops feeling emotionally relaxed around the person. They become more guarded with their thoughts, more cautious with vulnerability, and less expressive emotionally. Conversations that once felt natural now feel emotionally exhausting. They begin hiding parts of themselves because openness no longer feels safe. This is the beginning of emotional withdrawal. Many people fail to notice this stage because the empath often remains physically present while emotionally detaching internally. They may still respond, ND kindly, continue helping, or maintain routines, but the emotional intimacy has already started fading. Deep down, the empath is grieving the loss of emotional connection long before the relationship officially ends. Trust is not maintained through promises alone. It is maintained through emotional consistency and respectful behavior repeated over time. Every interaction either strengthens emotional safety or weakens it. When someone repeatedly disrespects emotions, dismisses vulnerability, or ignores emotional needs, they unknowingly teach the empath that opening up leads to pain rather than connection. Eventually, survival instincts take over. The empath realizes they cannot continue living in an emotionally unsafe environment without damaging their mental and emotional health. This realization is powerful because once an empath fully accepts that their peace is being destroyed by repeated emotional disrespect, their priorities begin changing completely. Instead of fighting hard for the relationship, they begin protecting themselves emotionally. And this is the moment many people misunderstand. They think the empath suddenly became cold or distant. In reality, the empath simply became emotionally exhausted from trying to feel safe in a place that consistently made them feel emotionally unseen, unheard, and unprotected. Manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional games push empaths into silent withdrawal because empaths are naturally sensitive to emotional instability. They may tolerate difficult situations longer than most people, but they are constantly observing emotional patterns beneath the surface. Even when they do not immediately confront unhealthy behavior, they feel the emotional tension internally. Over time, these repeated emotional disturbances slowly drain their trust, emotional energy, and sense of safety until the empath begins emotionally retreating without announcing it openly. Manipulation is especially damaging to empaths because they apologize, approach relationships with sincerity and emotional honesty. Most empaths communicate from a genuine place, so when someone uses guilt, mind games, emotional control, or dishonesty, the empath experiences deep internal conflict. At first, they may try to rationalize the behavior. They may tell themselves the person is struggling emotionally, stressed, afraid, or wounded from past experiences. Because empaths naturally see pain beneath behavior, they often continue giving understanding long after other people would walk away. However, manipulation creates emotional confusion that slowly destroys emotional clarity. One moment the manipulative person may show affection, vulnerability, or emotional closeness, and the next moment they become cold, dismissive, distant, or controlling. This emotional unpredictability keeps the empath mentally and emotionally exhausted. They begin questioning themselves constantly. They wonder if they are overreacting, misunderstanding the situation, or expecting too much. This internal confusion is one reason empaths often stay trapped in emotionally unhealthy relationships longer than they should. Emotional games create an even deeper level of psychological exhaustion. Silent treatment, mixed signals, jealousy tactics, attention withdrawal, passive-aggressive behavior, or intentionally creating insecurity forces the empath into a constant state of emotional analysis. Instead of feeling emotionally connected, the empath begins feeling emotionally unsafe. Their mind becomes consumed with trying to restore balance, understand changing moods, or repair problems they did not create. What many people fail to understand is that empaths crave emotional stability more than emotional intensity. While emotionally immature individuals may confuse chaos with passion, empaths eventually realize that inconsistency creates emotional damage. They do not feel secure around unpredictable behavior because their nervous systems absorb emotional tension deeply. Why? Even subtle emotional shifts affect them more strongly than most people realize. At first, the empath usually responds by trying harder. They communicate more, give more reassurance, become more patient, and attempt to fix the emotional disconnect. They believe honesty, compassion, and understanding can heal the relationship. But when manipulation and emotional games continue despite their efforts, something inside the empath begins shutting down quietly. This withdrawal rarely happens suddenly. It happens slowly and internally. The empath begins protecting parts of themselves emotionally. They stop sharing vulnerable thoughts. They become quieter during conversations. Their emotional energy becomes more limited. They stop chasing clarity because they realize the confusion itself has become the pattern. One of the most painful parts of silent withdrawal is that the empath often continues loving the person while emotionally detaching from the relationship. This creates a deep inter-RNAL struggle because empaths do not easily stop caring about people they once loved deeply. But eventually self-protection becomes stronger than emotional attachment. The empath recognizes that constant emotional instability is damaging their mental peace, emotional health, and sense of identity. By the time the empath fully withdraws emotionally, they are usually exhausted beyond words. People around them may feel shocked because the empath once seemed endlessly patient, forgiving, and emotionally invested. But what they fail to see is that the empath was silently carrying emotional pain for a very long time. They were absorbing the stress, confusion, inconsistency, and emotional tension while hoping things would improve. Eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point where silence feels safer than explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop arguing, stop chasing reassurance, and stop trying to force emotional honesty from someone unwilling to provide it. And when an empath reaches that stage, their silence is not weakness. It is emotional survival. Empaths often stay too long because they believe people can change. This belief comes from the way empaths naturally view human behavior. Instead of judging people only by their actions, empaths search for the emotional pain hidden underneath those actions. They see the insecurity behind arrogance, the fear behind anger, and the childhood wounds behind emotional distance. Because of this deep emotional understanding, empaths tend to give people more chances than most others would. When an empath cares about someone, they rarely focus only on who that person is in the present moment. They focus on who that person could become. They hold on to potential. They imagine healing, growth, emotional maturity, and transformation. Even when the relationship becomes painful, the empath keeps hoping that patience, love, understanding, and emotional support will eventually inspire change. This hope is powerful, but it can also become emotionally dangerous. Many empaths convince themselves that if they just communicate better, love harder, or become more understanding, the relationship will improve. They tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, emotional neglect, and unhealthy behavior because they keep believing the other person is capable of becoming emotionally healthier. The empath remembers the moments of kindness, vulnerability, or affection, and uses those moments as proof that the relationship can still be saved. This is why empaths often remain emotionally attached long after they begin feeling emotionally exhausted. They become emotionally invested not only in the relationship itself, but also in the future they imagined with that person. Walking away feels painful because it feels like abandoning the possibility of what the relationship could have become. The empath does not just grieve the current relationship, they grieve the dream attached to it. Unfortunately, emotionally unhealthy people sometimes take advantage of this trait. They recognize the empath's patience and emotional loyalty and assume the empath will never leave. They may offer temporary improvement after conflict, give small moments of affection after periods of neglect, or make promises about changing without consistently following through. These brief moments of hope keep the empath emotionally attached because empaths genuinely want to believe in growth and healing. What makes this cycle emotionally exhausting is that empaths often prioritize other people's emotional struggles over their own emotional pain. They become so focused on understanding why someone behaves badly that they ignore how deeply the behavior is affecting them internally. They excuse repeated hurt because they see the wounded person behind the harmful actions. Over time, this creates emotional imbalance where the empath constantly gives emotional energy while receiving very little emotional security in return. Empaths also struggle with GUI when considering leaving unhealthy relationships. Because they care deeply, they fear abandoning someone who may genuinely be struggling emotionally. They worry that leaving makes them selfish, cold, or unforgiving. This guilt keeps many empaths trapped in emotionally damaging situations far longer than necessary. They continue carrying emotional burdens because they feel responsible for helping others heal. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore. The empath slowly realizes that potential is not the same thing as change. Someone can have good intentions, painful experiences, or emotional wounds, and still continue behaving in harmful ways. Love alone cannot transform a person who refuses to take responsibility for their own healing and growth. This realization is heartbreaking for an empath because it forces them to accept that compassion cannot fix every relationship. At some point, they understand that staying in constant emotional pain while waiting for someone to change is slowly destroying their own mental and emotional health. They begin recognizing that self-sacrifice is not the same thing as love. When an empath finally reaches this stage of awareness, something shifts deeply inside them. They stop focusing on who the person could become and start paying attention to who the person consistently shows themselves to be. And once that emotional clarity fully arrives, the empath begins choosing peace, boundaries, and self-respect over endless emotional suffering. Once an empath emotionally disconnects, they rarely return the same way again. Many people misunderstand this because empaths are known for their patience, forgiveness, and emotional depth. They often assume the empath will always stay, always care, and always continue giving chances no matter how much pain occurs. But what most people fail to realize is that an empath's emotional detachment does not happen suddenly. It is usually the final result of prolonged emotional exhaustion, repeated disappointment, broken trust, and emotional neglect that slowly wears down the connection over time. Empaths do not emotionally disconnect after one mistake or one difficult argument. In most cases, they fight internally for a very long time before reaching that point. They communicate their feelings, try to understand the other person's perspective, offer patience, and search for solutions repeatedly. Because empaths naturally value emotional connection, they often work harder than most people to preserve relationships. They want harmony, understanding, and emotional closeness. They genuinely hope problems can be repaired. But every relationship has an emotional breaking point. When an empath repeatedly feels unheard, emotionally unsafe, manipulated, dismissed, or emotionally drained, something begins changing quietly inside them. At first, the changes are subtle. They become less emotionally expressive. They stop sharing certain thoughts or feelings. They begin protecting their inner world because vulnerability no longer feels emotionally safe. Even while they continue showing kindness outwardly, internally they are slowly withdrawing emotional investment. One reason people are shocked when an empath finally disconnects is because empaths rarely announce the exact moment they emotionally give up. They continue trying long after they are already hurting deeply. They keep showing up emotionally while silently carrying disappointment, sadness, and emotional fatigue. By the time the relationship officially ends or the empath emotionally detaches completely, they have often spent months grieving internally without anyone realizing it. This silent grieving process changes the empath profoundly. The person who once fought for communication eventually becomes quiet. The person who once begged for emotional honesty eventually stops asking questions. The person who once chased connection eventually stops reaching out. Not because they stopped caring instantly, but because they became emotionally exhausted from carrying the entire emotional weight of the relationship alone. When an empath reaches emotional detachment, it is usually because they finally accepted a painful truth. Love cannot survive without emotional safety, mutual effort, and respect. This realization creates a deep internal shift. Instead of focusing on saving the relationship, the empath begins focusing on protecting their peace. Their priorities change. Emotional survival becomes more important than emotional attachment. What makes this stage so permanent is that empaths remember emotional pain deeply. Because they absorb emotional experiences intensely, repeated hurt leaves lasting emotional impressions. Even if they forgive someone later, the emotional innocence they once had in the relationship is often gone. Trust no longer feels natural. Vulnerability no longer feels effortless. The emotional openness that once existed becomes guarded. This is why relationships are rare. Lie return to the same emotional depth after an empath disconnects. The empath may still care about the person, but something fundamental has changed inside them. They no longer view the relationship with the same emotional trust, hope, or emotional dependence they once had. Their heart learned caution through pain. Another important truth is that once an empath chooses themselves after a long period of emotional suffering, they grow emotionally stronger. They begin developing boundaries they previously ignored. They become more protective of their emotional energy and more selective about who receives access to their inner world. The experience teaches them that constantly sacrificing their peace for others eventually destroys them from within. People often mistake the empath's silence after detachment as coldness or indifference. In reality, it is usually emotional self-preservation. The empath understands that returning fully to a relationship that repeatedly hurt them would require reopening wounds they worked painfully hard to heal. And once an empath truly learns the cost of abandoning themselves for love, they rarely return to the relationship or to the version of themselves that tolerated emotional pain for so long in the same way again. Healthy relationships with empaths require honesty, emotional stability, and mutual respect because empaths experience emotional connection on a much deeper level than most people realize. They are highly sensitive not only to words, but also to emotional energy, tone, behavior patterns, and emotional consistency. Because of this, superficial communication or emotionally confusing behavior quickly creates emotional discomfort for them. An empath may remain quiet about what they feel at first, but internally they are constantly observing whether the relationship feels emotionally safe, genuine, and balanced. Honesty is one of the most important foundations in any relationship with an empath. Empaths value emotional truth, the more than perfection. They understand that people make mistakes, struggle emotionally, and sometimes fail. What hurts them most is deception, emotional hiding, manipulation, or pretending to feel something that is not genuine. Because empaths naturally sense emotional inconsistencies, dishonesty creates deep internal tension for them. Even when they cannot immediately explain why something feels wrong, their intuition often detects emotional misalignment long before facts become visible. This is why emotional transparency matters so much with an empath. Open communication builds trust because it creates emotional clarity. When someone communicates honestly about their feelings, fears, needs, or struggles, the empath feels emotionally included rather than emotionally shut out. They do not expect perfection from the people they love. They simply want sincerity and emotional accountability. A truthful conversation, even if difficult, usually feels safer to an empath than emotional avoidance or hidden resentment. Emotional stability is equally important because empaths absorb emotional environments deeply. Constant chaos, unpredictable mood swings, manipulation, passive aggression, or emotional inconsistency create emotional exhaustion for them over time. An empath thrives in environments where communication feels calm, respectful, and emotionally balanced. This does not mean relationships must be free from conflict. Every relationship experiences disagreements and emotional challenges. What matters is how those challenges are handled. Emotionally healthy relationships allow both people to communicate openly without fear of humiliation, emotional punishment, or emotional withdrawal. When conflict happens in a stable relationship, both individuals work toward understanding instead of trying to control, manipulate, or emotionally dominate each other. This emotional maturity helps the empath feel secure because they know disagreements will not suddenly destroy emotion. Now, safety. Mutual respect is another essential part of maintaining a healthy relationship with an empath. Empaths naturally give emotional support, compassion, patience, and understanding to the people they care about. However, problems begin when this emotional giving becomes one-sided. Many empaths unintentionally become emotional caretakers in relationships, constantly supporting others while neglecting their own emotional needs. Over time, this imbalance creates emotional burnout and silent resentment. A healthy relationship requires reciprocity. The empath should not be the only one listening, understanding, forgiving, comforting, and emotionally investing. Their feelings, boundaries, emotional needs, and mental well-being must also be respected and protected. When someone consistently dismisses an empath's emotions, ignores their boundaries, or treats their sensitivity as weakness, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally unsafe. Respect also means valuing the empath's emotional experience. Channel depth instead of criticizing it. Many empaths spend years being told they are too emotional, too sensitive, or too caring. In reality, their emotional awareness is one of their greatest strengths. Healthy partners recognize this sensitivity as emotional intelligence rather than weakness. They appreciate the empath's loyalty, intuition, compassion, and emotional presence instead of taking those qualities for granted. One of the most beautiful things about loving an empath is that when they feel emotionally safe, respected, and valued, they love with extraordinary depth and sincerity. They create relationships filled with emotional connection, support, understanding, and genuine care. But this level of emotional intimacy can only survive in environments built on honesty, emotional stability, and mutual effort. At the end of the day, empaths do not need perfect people. They need emotionally mature people. People who communicate honestly, handle emotions responsibly, respect boundaries, and contribute equally to the emotional health of the relationship. When those elements exist together, relationships with empaths become deeply meaningful, emotionally healing, and incredibly strong.